technology. I was saying it's a great honour to be speaking today on some research and observations on other people's research around this issue of the very rapid growth in Australia's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population, which collectively we call Indigenous. So there are the two main subpopulations that come under the umbrella of Indigenous, as you'd know, Isabel. So without further ado, just a brief introduction on my university and where I'm from. It looks quite different to where I'm sitting right now. The Northern Territory is in the middle top there. It's one of 8 states and territories of Australia. And Darwin is the capital. And that's very much a tropical northern city of 150,000 people. Small, obviously, and it's only 2 hours flight to Bali, but it's 5 hours flight to Sydney. So it gives you a sense of its geographical and sort of geopolitical positioning on the globe. Charles Darwin University, I work at the Northern Institute, which you see here. Beautiful Chinese garden there, and the rest is scrub. We call it right near the beach. And this is Darwin City. We have crocodiles, of course. They will eat you if you go into their territory, but we also eat our crocodiles. We like to have crocodile burgers. They're very tasty. Tropical climate, we have very devastating cyclones every now and then, but also very warm throughout the year. Our university is very young. I think we've made the top 200 young universities in the world recently. Maybe top 100, I can't remember. Anyway, we're doing okay.
When was it founded?
Oh, it depends how you define it. So under the official university name, 1998, I think. Yeah, so quite young. And this is my team here in Australia, just to give you a sense of how we see our purpose in the world and what we aim to achieve with our research, which is really to conduct independent, robust research as demographers and human geographers to make a difference to communities and to policy making. So down to the talk for today in proper. This quote kind of sums up the premise of my talk. For hardcore demographers, this isn't going to be a hardcore demographic experience for you, but there's definitely we'll touch on some demographic methods for understanding this issue, which is kind of a nexus between demography, sociology, history, anthropology, and just about any other social science you care to name. And it's around this notion of people either engaging temporarily with a certain identity and then disengaging with that, or then going the other way and changing over time or not changing over time, their sense of identity. So today's talk is in 3 main parts. We'll first give you the context in understanding what's been happening in terms of the spatial and demographic scale of growth and what some of the drivers for the growth in Australia's Indigenous population are. Then we'll talk a bit more about what all that means in various aspects and what impacts that's having on policy and in other areas. And then I guess I'll sum up with my thoughts on what we can learn from this issue as a collective issue, particularly as demographers. I would like to be upfront and recognise, I don't know if it's obvious, but I'm not a first Australian. I don't identify as such, but I have been blessed to have a lot of professional experience and a lot of friends who are, and I've learned a lot about Indigenous culture, way of life, and how people see the world. So I've been really lucky with that. So this, I don't claim to speak for Indigenous people of Australia, but I have learnt a lot, and I'm kind of reinterpreting what I've learned along with the research that I've done and others have done to give you an overview of this topic. So part 1. I thought we'd start at the start, before colonisation. it's perhaps not widely known even within the Australian population that there were some 400 heterogeneous Indigenous First Australian groups, if you like, or clans, for a lack of a better word, before colonisation, each with their own language, and each, as I say, with a great deal of diversity in their cultural practices and their beliefs, and the way they interact with other societies. And to give you an example, there's, as you probably know, there's a common term called the dream time, which speaks about, you know, how the land was formed. It's basically the creation story. That umbrella term is actually quite meaningless to each of these groups because each has their own dream time story, if you like, that reflects their connection to the land and each other. So yeah, we've had 60,000 years of unceded existence, I guess you call it. We don't have a treaty. There are calls for a treaty. And post-colonisation, as I'm sure you're aware, and I believe somebody online is studying Canadian First Nations people, it's a history of oppression and deliberate, if you like, segmentation and fragmentation of the population that really continued, and, you know, in some ways does continue, arguably continued until at least the 1970s. Yeah, in the shape of institutional segregation, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a second.
Sorry for question. What is Torres Strait Islander?
Yeah, so Torres. So we have Indigenous people, Aboriginal people from the mainland, and Torres Strait Islander people. Torres Strait Islander is tip of Cape York, which is on the top of Queensland. There's a bunch of islands there. See the red circle right in there? Yeah. So I'm guessing 40 islands or so up there. Yeah. And that's Torres Strait Island. But you find Torres Strait Island people now spread across Australia, quite different culturally, and you know, the traditional dress is very different. It's the dress, for example, for ceremonies looks more like the dress attire of people from New Guinea, for example, it's up here, not far away. In fact, from the northernmost island, you can see Papua New Guinea. You can visually, on a good day, you can see it. And people take their fishing boats over and all that. So yeah. So we'll go there. So the contrast of history that's represented here and the modern day takes many shapes and forms. One is that, of course, governments want to identify what the population of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people is. And unfortunately, it's a very imperfect science. We don't have, as you do here, well, we're starting to get some linked government data sets, but there are inadequacies there. So it's down to now the basis of our population estimates for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people come from what's called the standard Indigenous question on our census form, and it asks if you are of Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander origin. No, yes, you can tick both here. Some people identify as both.
And these standard questionnaires don't allow multiple identities of mixed original.
No, unfortunately, but I'm going to argue later on that we need to think about a different way of doing this. Yeah, it does allow multiple ancestry, but only two. Yeah, there's an ancestry question. So looking at the spatial distribution of the population, again, if you ask the average Australian on the street, whatever the average is, you know, where do most Aboriginal people live? You might still get the answer of in the desert. You know, there's kind of this not well known that the concentration is very much like the non-Indigenous population. It's around the east coast of Australia and to some extent in Perth. Yeah, so 35% of First Australians live in our biggest cities: Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, Perth, Adelaide. And a further 22%, other big cities close to that, so Geelong, Wollongong, and so on, around here. And Gold Coast, Sunshine Coast, a very much an urbanised population, which surprises some people, and the rate of urbanisation is fast. You know, that's an ongoing long-term trend.
So sorry, these percentages represent of the indigenous population.
Yes, sorry, not of the total, no. That's right.
That could mean that even if the percentage is high, that they are a very low proportion of the total population.
So I should have said, yes, thank you for picking up on it. I come from the Northern Territory, which is this jurisdiction here, and we have a population of 249,000. 1/3 are Aboriginal. So yeah, exactly what you say. So throughout here, the numbers are small, but the proportion are high. And in lots of the little towns, it's 90%. Yeah, Aboriginal, you know, scattered throughout here. So what's been happening with growth? You know, it kind of mirrors the pre-existing settlement patterns in that nearly all of the growth, so keeping in mind that the light yellow is negative population change. Nearly all the growth has been concentrated for the last 30 years in and around major cities and the coastline, and indeed the cities that surround our big cities. Yeah. And the last 30 years or more, 50 years, has seen a great deal of social change and policy change. And I suppose you'd say growth in acceptance, curiosity and understanding and collegiality towards Indigenous issues and Indigenous well-being. And so to highlight how bad things were, it wasn't until 1971 that Aboriginal people were counted in the population at all of Australia. So prior to that, thank you so much. Thanks, Father. Prior to that, only those that were deemed to be what we call full caste were counted. So this was pretty terrible, and the rest were seen as not part of Australia. They're just outcasts in their own country. Yeah. So 2 lines on this chart. The higher line is the population estimate that's later derived from the census count of that year. So we have a census every 5 years, and from that we do some magic demography and we estimate. You'll see that the gap is growing or grew rapidly between the census and the estimates. So this is down to issues with trying to enumerate a very spread out and linguistically diverse population. That, you know, for many, the census is kind of a meaningless concept for many cultural reasons. So also happening in this time period since 1971 has been significant growth and significant amounts of land rights legislation and successful claims. So in the Northern Territory, where I live, 79% of the landmass is Aboriginal owned, which makes, which is in theory great, but makes doing industry difficult, mining, agriculture and so on, because there needs to be negotiations and royalties and so on. Yet we've had improvements to the census process, which have also helped to pick up populations that were previously missed. Things like employing local Indigenous people to do the census in language at their community. And then in 2009, we had a national apology in the Parliament, which really seems to have sort of springboarded the desire for many people who previously didn't identify as Indigenous to do so, a new sort of upwelling of pride, if you like, but also for parents to then declare their children as Indigenous when previously they might not have on the census form. So this led to growth in the population of 23% from the 2016 to 2021 census. So, but that's nearly 5% a year, that's big. The non-Indigenous population grew by 6% during that same period. So a big difference in the growth trajectories. And as you'll understand, I'm probably alluding to, the growth in itself is not driven by what we might call demographic factors. So the excess of births over deaths, and to some extent migration to and from overseas does occur. Rather, the 56%, I think, of the growth from this figure in the 2016 census, 649,000, to the 2021 census count of nearly 813,000. 56% was due to these non-demographic factors. And primarily, as we'll discover, this phenomenon of changing identification. So again, just looking at the spatial distribution of non-demographic growth, ignore the scale, it's not the best map, I'm sorry, but you can see it replicates what we've seen already insofar as it's non-demographic growth is also concentrated spatially where the highest rates of growth have been and the highest concentrations of population. Now, essentially, you know, this pattern represents the chronology of settlement in Australia, of colonisation. So, you know, starting in Sydney and then the bigger cities and then fanning out inland a bit from there. And last to be discovered were all these areas here. So we'll talk a bit about the demographic aspects of that. So non-demographic growth is driven primarily by people changing their identification on the census form, on one census to another. So this is, you've probably seen these diagrams to represent migration. These are Sankey diagrams, I love them, because they do paint a good visual picture. Let's start with and this is old data, but if you replicate the newest data, which we don't have as yet because it comes from the linked data set and they're still linking up the 21 census with the previous ones. Let's start with the base population in 2011 of Indigenous people. You can see obviously that most people that said they were Indigenous in 2011 also in 2016 said they were Indigenous. Fine. But we have a group of people here who peeled off from their Indigenous identification and went to non-Indigenous, 45,000. Okay, so there's change both ways. But 3 times that amount, just about, were those who went from declaring themselves as non-Indigenous to Indigenous, 129,000. And so this is really where this growth is coming from in the urban cores of Australia. What we call new identifiers, for lack of a better term. And then we have some people who go from not stated on the form, unfortunately, to being Indigenous, or again, not stated. And we have Indigenous births contributing to the updated population, and of course, deaths taking away here. So.
Can I ask something about this? Is there the possibility to see by age? If so,
Yeah.
And also the birth. So I think births are also included or not? As it changed from 2010?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, so these are migrating into the population. Yeah. And the deaths are migrating out there. Yeah. Yeah, so the TFR for Indigenous people is coming down quite rapidly, which is begging the question, you know, is there a demographic transition coming into play for that population? You know, where I come from, the population pyramid is literally a pyramid, but it's starting to sort of change. So it's a fascinating time. So what's some of the things that are driving this phenomenon of identity switching, if you like, or changing identity? So so we have people who are becoming Indigenous, so to speak, and people who are no longer Indigenous. But the net, as I've said, is contributing quite heavily to growth between censuses, and has for 30 years. Well, there is a really a lack of research on why, and one of the reasons for this is because this whole issue, of course, brings up the trauma caused by colonisation, segregation, deliberate institutionalisation, vilification, all of the things that happen, not to mention just all out war and killings and mass killings and so on that have reverberated down through time. And to be honest, there's plenty of racism still alive in Australia today, unfortunately. But so this, for Aboriginal people to talk about this stuff is very sensitive, because they may have had parents who were taken away from their family. We're not far on from having that stolen generation impact on kids that you may have heard about. So you can understand that doing such research would be very difficult. And there's only one piece of research that's directly talked to Aboriginal, 23 Aboriginal people, who of course can't represent the spectrum of experiences across Australia. But it's quite obvious that some of the big societal events, if you like, and changes like land rights are indeed driving this phenomenon. Land rights, people are gradually understanding that being Aboriginal is something to be proud of, and that the wider society is interested and does support growing knowledge about our cultural ancestry. And yes, the major reconciliation actions, such as our national apology. And it won't come as a surprise to some of you that this whole phenomenon of net identification change driving growth in the population is also occurring in Canada, New Zealand, and the USA with their respective First Nations population. And I just want to sort of touch on this briefly, but so it's underpinning this net identification change is a high proportion of unions between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. And in fact, the next chart will show that we've had this massive growth in the Indigenous and non-Indigenous partnered couples in Australia. And if you think about this from a demographic perspective, of course, this is constantly growing the pool from which Indigenous babies can be derived or come forward. So if the mother is Indigenous, for example, in the partnership, there's a 93% chance that the baby, on the birth certificate, the baby will be declared as Indigenous. If the father is Indigenous and the mother is not, it's something like an 88% chance that the baby will be declared.
But this is decided by the parents.
Correct, yes, yeah, again. Which of course, again, explains some of the changes. And back to your question, or somebody's question about age, sorry. A good degree of this transition from non-Indigenous to Indigenous is indeed in those aged under 10.
Under 10?
Yeah, or 10 or under.
So the kids.
So it's the parents deciding, last time I didn't want to declare my child as Indigenous. This time I feel that the world's in a better place and conditioned for them to be declared as such and to be proud of that. Yeah.
Do you know what kids declare? The kids have different identity and they group as adults and declare themselves. Yes, and that's what they are. Differently from what their parents 5 years ago.
Yes, definitely.
Arrow from Indigenous to non-Indigenous.
Some of it, yeah. So people can go, so we only have 3 longitudinal data points so far. We're waiting for the 4th, which is coming out, I think, in October. So this is a linked census data set. And yes, so people do go from not to being Indigenous and then back to not. And then they go, all the combinations of that. Indigenous, Indigenous, not, non-Indigenous, non-Indigenous, Indigenous, it's all there. But that would make this diagram very messy.
But you know what, for example, do you have hospital records where the people have to declare if they are indigenous or not, and then you could compare this.
Yeah.
And then you can see if this says, so if the people declare them different, in different situations,
Yeah.
what can also be, no? So,
Yeah.
because it is not like, I don't know, a document that you have here, it's written, it is always the self-declared.
Yeah, I try and sum up the answer to that briefly. There is a new multi-agency government data set that's just been put together. It's very, very, very complex to get the data from it. But yes, it has tax, social benefits, hospital, vaccination, just about everything, education, just about everything you can think of. So that's new. Hi, good morning. Secondly, in at least two of the big states, the heavily populated states, New South Wales, Victoria, the birth records are quite poor, such that recently the way that identification is done. I used to get the doctor will just go, oh yeah, you know, one of the parents has got dark skin, we'll just.
So the doctor is.
Yeah, it used to be, but now the procedures are changing. So we don't have that time series data, reliable data as yet to work on. Then the other issue is in the more remote and regional parts of Australia. You get things like the kids being given multiple names. So it's quite difficult, you know, so linking becomes problematic over time. All these issues come down to some data issues. Yes.
You were mentioning social benefits.
Yeah.
And I just know from the visit there that they told me that the additional people would then be granted housing or things like this or support. Is this then connected to changes from non-Indigenous to Indigenous?
Yeah, I was going to touch on that shortly. This is the perception of some people. There's absolutely no research on this. It is true that there are a range of targeted benefits, not necessarily housing. Social housing is given to in theory, there's a 5-year wait list, but it's given to anybody below a threshold. But yes, there is recognition of compensation for Indigenous people in various areas with support for getting jobs and the rest of it. So yes, there is the perception amongst some non-Aboriginal people that people are just doing it for money and benefits. Personally, I don't buy that. Yeah, but I've got no proof. So let's recap part one. Large growth in the Indigenous population in Australia in the past 3 decades. Non-demographic factors are the main driver. Spatially, it's correlated with big cities and surrounding those in remote areas, reflecting that fanning out from big cities during colonisation. And the reasons are complex, and examining this issue brings up our dark past and not too distant dark past. When you think about being counted in the census, for example. So part two, what are some of the consequences and impacts now and into the future? Okay, so in theory, we might think that this growing social acceptance of our first Australian population is a good thing. But of course, in practice, government and demographers are trying to categorise people into either you're Indigenous or you're not, and then we compare across socio-economic variables to see what's happening with the population and advise governments accordingly. But of course, we can not fit the spectrum of people's experiences into a box like we essentially do here with the census and on birth records. Life just isn't like that. And of course, the changing identification of individuals reflects that complex personal and social realms, if you like. And unfortunately, as I think Isabella's question touches on, there's a growing understanding now of this phenomenon in society. It's one of Australia's main demographic trends, and it's kind of created this space, if you like, for this divisive and racist assertions around, you're not a real Aboriginal, you're just doing it to claim benefits and so on. And yeah, I don't buy that, but unfortunately it's real and it's there, it's in the discourse, in the media and elsewhere. And actually when I first published something on this stuff, I would get abusive phone calls from land councils who represent real Aboriginal people collectively about, how dare you publish this stuff and so on. But I think it needs to be out there in the public discourse. And at the moment we're at a critical juncture because I'm not sure if you're aware we have a national referendum coming up later in the year. The date is not set yet to provide to ask this question below, to change the constitution to allow Aboriginal voice to Parliament. It hasn't been explained very well as to what that means, but it would be a representative group of people that for any policy which impacts First Australians, which is pretty much everything, this voice, this group of people will be consulted. There's no legislative binding. There's no provision for the government to adhere to the advice of the voice. But it's a first step, I think, towards a treaty and towards having recognition in the Constitution. And it's very rare that a referendum is successful in Australia. So this is highly controversial and it's stirring up all this talk again.
Is there a minimum threshold?
Yeah. More than 50% of individual referenda counts, and more than 50% of the states and more than 60% of the states and territories, which complicates it. That's stuff. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But the Northern Territory is, because it's not a state, 60% of the states, because it's not a state, it doesn't get included in that latter condition of 60%. And so you essentially no voice in this referendum for that jurisdiction. Yeah, where there is 33% of the population are Aboriginal. That's a quirk of the Constitution. It's written into the Constitution. That's not going to change. So just a little bit more about the current times, because it is really an important time in the Australian Indigenous affairs. I'm hoping that people online can at least hear this video, if not see it, but I do apologise if you can't see it, but you'll get the gist of it, the crux of it from listening. And it's just to give you a feel of what's coming up. If the referendum is successful, then I would anticipate another big jump up in non-demographic growth. If it's not, I don't know what's going to happen. We really do step back a long time then, because it wouldn't be possible to try this again for many decades. Politically, it would be suicide, and society wouldn't. It costs a lot of money, millions and millions. And society wouldn't tolerate that. So personally, I'm hoping that it's a yes, but unfortunately, there are lots of different voices contributing, including, senior Indigenous people who disagree and really strongly disagree on the value of this process.
And this referendum is only on this question, or is it linked with another question?
No, it's just this, because it would definitely confuse the issue, I think, for the general public. If we try to think about two things at once, we're simple in Australia. Yeah.
bar over there.
Oh, yeah.
And you have about 5 to 10 minutes.
Sure.
So then, because we have some questions.
Yeah. Okay. So what's the problem here? One problem is that this vacuum is created for racist assertions. The second is more practical, which is about how we measure gaps for targeted policies to improve First Australians' socio-economic status. And we have a national agreement on closing the gap with 19 targets in it. And one of those is, for example, life expectancy. Everyone lives long and healthy lives. And the target is to close the gap in life expectancy by 2031. Never let politicians set targets because it was never going to happen because while the Indigenous life expectancy is growing, the non-Indigenous is growing faster. So the gap is still going to be there, if not bigger, in 2030. Yeah, depends which method you use. We just had a big review of the methods and it's all a bit scary, but officially 8.9 years for men and 7 point something for women. But in the Northern Territory where I'm from, it's around about 13 and 11. A bigger difference. The more remote you are, the higher, the bigger the gap.
It's ambitious to close it in 10 years.
Well, the target was actually made in 2011, I think. But even so, yeah, it's just, you know, don't let politicians decide on what the target should be. I've had some experience with that. The methodological and the methods underpinning the current way we produce Indigenous life expectancies is very complex and very broad and not robust. So we outwardly, I'm on the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Statistical Advisory Group, and we overtly advise people not to compare life expectancy over time because there are significant issues in linking death records. So you can imagine when we're trying to track things over time, and we're saying, don't look at time, you can't look at time. And then we add this issue of inserting this whole new population every time, every census, into the denominator, right? It creates issues for measurement again. So, because if we look at some socioeconomic gaps, and these data are derived from this longitudinal data set that I mentioned with the 3 time periods, we see that we have the blue is the newly identified Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people, orange is consistently identifying, and grey is consistently identifying non-Indigenous over those 3 censuses. The people that are injecting themselves into the Indigenous population have socioeconomic characteristics that are more like the non-Indigenous population. So if you think about closing the gap in life expectancy, this ongoing process is kind of artificially closing the gap. Artificially is giving a boost, if you like, to closing the gap when in places like the Northern Territory, there is literally third world conditions for Aboriginal people still, and it's shameful. I know because I've been to the remote places. So this process is kind of marked at the national level, where a lot of the money decisions are made, is masking the real disadvantage amongst remote living Indigenous people. So I'm going to keep going. What about the future? Well, just a couple of quick charts from a paper that I produced with Tom Wilson and Jeremy Temple and a couple of others. You've probably heard of Tom Wilson in Australia. Using a cohort component model where we ask what does, and so I should preface this with the fact that official population projections from the Bureau of Statistics don't include identification change in their assumptions. So of course they always fall grossly short of the actual eventual population. Fortunately, from this paper, they have agreed to include it in the new population, the 2021 drop-off population projections, some scenarios at least. So we did this in 2016, asking how does the net identification change rate, if we include that based on past data and just let it play out, what does that do to the size and spatial distribution of the population? and what happens regionally, and then can we distill the growth by its drivers, so then essentially demographic and non-demographic. Just briefly, including net identification change clearly produces a much higher projected population than the official, which is the green line. But note that we did this in 2016. Now that you'll see that our projection for 2021 was down at 800,000. The actual 2021 estimate came in at 980,000. So even over 5 years, we were 180,000 people short in our projection. And the ABS was something like 212,000 short. So these are big differences. Now, 53% growth to 2051 compared to ABS, the Bureau Stats projections 34%, and some other numbers there. 136% growth compared to 55% for non-Indigenous Australians. Including identification change rates obviously has that big impact. Spatially, I guess it just reinforces where the growth will be, and that's very much in the big cities and surrounds. Noting that's a logarithmic scale there. So Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, 200% growth in Sydney is obviously massive, especially when you compare to the Northern Territory and the remote parts of South Australia. What about the drivers? Well, it won't be a surprise that identification change is anticipated to contribute around about 50% of growth to Sydney and the rest of New South Wales, most of which is in the larger cities in New South Wales, and in Tasmania, and nationally 42%. So that's the green. And then, population momentum is quite large for some regions, but not others. And various other drivers there. Life expectancy increases, interestingly, contributing, sort of paling into insignificance when compared to net identification change. All right, so what can we learn? Just briefly wrapping up. Well, something has to change, and I think the questions so far have kind of spoken to that. We can't sort of go on having this as just something that happens in our official statistics without sort of addressing it as a nation. One way we can do that is to produce projections as demographers and to have scenarios around identification change, and then to sort of contribute to discussion on why this is happening and what it all means for us as a nation. But ultimately, in my opinion, this discourse must be driven by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people themselves. How do they see it, and how do they want to talk about it in a local, regional and national sense? How do they want non-Indigenous Australians and, for example, new migrants to the country? How do we educate people about this stuff? Because it's a phenomenon of the present day, but it has strong links back to when we were colonised. But on a more practical level, as you've alluded to, how might we define Indigenous moving forward? There are many ways, do you have to prove that one of your parents is Indigenous? Do we start taking blood from people? No. There are some health surveys in Australia that offer people to opt in for this, for health reasons, but obviously in a census we can't do that. Do the linked data sets at the national level offer some hope? It's too early to tell, but the problem again is that in remote areas, people aren't engaging with these official data sets in the right ways for them to be robustly included in the population estimates that might be derived from the multi-agency data set. So basically, the summary here is nothing that's perfect moving forward, but I think the voice for this must come from Indigenous people. And I think that this is all about data sovereignty as well, which on data sovereignty, nationally, there is very much a force for change coming from senior Indigenous researchers and leaders, because for too long we've just collected data and published it and said, that speaks about Aboriginal people, when in fact data sovereignty is really something quite different. And nothing that's proposed here, or probably any other method that's been proposed, really compensates for the cultural determinants of health and well-being that might feed into projections and life expectancy methods, but currently don't. So just a quick one on data sovereignty, because it is, again, a related issue and a big issue. That's the current definition, and it's about any data that relates to Aboriginal people. And it demands that data reflect Indigenous people's priorities as opposed to government priorities. We're a long way from that, but there is a movement. So just summing up some learnings. Most of these we talked about here. Applied learnings are that cultural mobility or ethnic mobility is a big force. It's one of our major demographic trends. It's going to continue as per the projections. Brings into question these targeted policies. The referendum is hopefully a turning point so far as it gets up, and then we can start a new discourse about all of this stuff, knowing that we have enshrined into the Constitution recognition. What about us as demographers? Well, just some personal reflections, and you may or may not agree. I'm not sure if we're allowed to have emotions as demographers, but sometimes they creep in when the numbers are too much. So I think it emphasises our responsibility to apply our demographic lenses to contribute to positive change in society, which hopefully we will do. The past always influences the present, no matter how far back you go into the past. Yes, demographers are good with numbers, but we've really got to seek the truth on what's behind them, because all demos, or any two groups of people who might appear as very similar, such as Aboriginal people in remote Western Australia and Aboriginal people in remote Northern Territory, are actually very different, very heterogeneous when you dig enough and when you seek enough information from your data. And digging into numbers can help us and others to redress stereotypes. And I don't like this. Well, I don't like it, but this representation here, 18th century Dutch diagram of how the Dutch view people in the rest of the world. So top left, you have a European couple in the 18th century, and then you have your Asian couple moving to the right, and your African couple and your American couple. Of course, you're going from the well-to-do to the savage native, and then French, no, English, Dutch person, and a German person, and a French person, sorry, down below. Men, so stereotypes, and that's where really I think I'm trying to push this is to change stereotypes to help at least. I've provided here, I'm sure you'll get a copy of the slides if you want them. Some of the articles that relate directly to this, including the projections I mentioned, on which hopefully the national projections are going to change. So that feel free to have some further reading. And on that note, I will finish up. That's all, folks.